The Boeing 777 cruised at 37,000 feet above the Pacific, its passengers settling into the rhythm of a routine red-eye flight from Seattle to Tokyo. In row 8, seat C, Lieutenant Commander Valentina "Ghost" Kozlov had pulled her baseball cap low over her eyes, trying to catch whatever sleep she could manage in the cramped economy seat. Her worn leather jacket bore no insignia, no hint of the classified operations she'd flown in the darkest corners of the world. To the businessman beside her scrolling through emails, she was just another tired traveler. The first sign something was wrong came at 2:47 a.m. when the cabin lights flickered once, then twice. Ghost's eyes opened immediately, a reflex honed by 8 years of combat flying where the smallest anomaly could mean death. She kept perfectly still, but her peripheral vision caught the subtle change in the flight attendants' movements. Their practiced smiles had tightened almost imperceptibly. Then she heard it, a sound that made her blood freeze despite 2 decades of military training, the unmistakable whisper of tactical boots on carpet, moving with the deliberate precision of operators who'd done this dance 1,000 times before. Ghost didn't move, didn't even shift her breathing pattern, but every nerve in her body went to maximum alert. 3 rows behind her, a man in a rumpled business suit was no longer typing on his laptop. Instead, his hands rested motionless on the keyboard while his eyes swept the cabin with the methodical intensity of a predator cataloging prey. 2 rows ahead, another passenger had abandoned her magazine, her posture too perfect, too controlled for someone allegedly engrossed in celebrity gossip. The realization hit Ghost like a physical blow. Navy SEALs, on her flight, moving into position with the fluid coordination of a unit that had trained together until their movements became instinct. But why? Her last mission had been a routine transport run, medical supplies to a forward operating base in Afghanistan, nothing that should have triggered this level of response. She counted heartbeats, forcing herself to maintain the relaxed posture of sleep while her mind raced through possibilities. Had someone blown her cover? Was this about the incident in Syria 3 months ago, the one that officially never happened? Or was she walking into something entirely different, something that required the best of the best to be positioned around a single woman in economy class? The tactical boots stopped moving. Ghost could feel eyes on her, studying her with the intensity of professionals who'd been briefed on exactly who they were dealing with. In the reflection of her phone's black screen, she caught a glimpse of the operator 2 rows back. Young, focused, and wearing the kind of expression that said he knew this sleeping woman could kill him with her bare hands before he could draw his sidearm. The plane's engines hummed steadily through the night, carrying them all toward whatever storm was waiting. Command had called her Ghost for good reason. Throughout her career, Valentina Kozlov had possessed an almost supernatural ability to appear and disappear from impossible situations, flying under radar coverage so low that her aircraft's belly scraped desert dunes, extracting wounded soldiers from hostile territory while enemy fighters swarmed like angry wasps overhead, completing missions that existed only in the most classified files, operations that would never see the light of congressional hearings or military histories. But sitting motionless in row 8, she felt anything but invisible. The SEAL team's presence created an electromagnetic field of tension that seemed to pulse through the cabin. She could sense their positions without looking, 5 operators total, positioned with overlapping fields of fire that would eliminate any possibility of escape or resistance. Professional. Thorough. Exactly what she would have deployed if their roles were reversed. The flight attendant approached with a slight tremor in her otherwise steady hands. "Can I get you anything, miss?" The question sounded normal enough, but Ghost caught the micro-hesitation before "miss," the way the woman's eyes darted toward the SEAL in the business suit. "Just some water, thanks," Ghost replied without opening her eyes, her voice carrying the drowsy rasp of someone half asleep. But internally, she was mapping exit routes, calculating distances, assessing the tactical situation with the same cold precision that had kept her alive through 200 combat missions. The water arrived in a plastic cup that the flight attendant set down with hands that shook almost imperceptibly. Ghost accepted it with a mumbled thanks, noting how the woman's breathing had accelerated slightly. Civilian under stress, probably briefed just enough to be terrified but not enough to understand why. As the hours crawled by, Ghost began to piece together fragments of the operation surrounding her. The SEALs rotated positions in 15-minute intervals, maintaining visual contact while appearing to sleep, read, or use the restroom. Their coordination spoke of extensive rehearsal, suggesting this wasn't an improvised response but a carefully planned operation. The question that gnawed at her wasn't how they'd found her. Military intelligence had ways of tracking personnel even on civilian flights. The question was why they needed 5 of the military's most elite operators to approach one pilot who was, officially at least, between assignments, and carrying nothing more dangerous than a worn paperback novel and a bag of peanuts from the airport. Unless they knew about the data chip concealed in the false bottom of her carry-on luggage, the one containing flight records from a mission that, according to every official document, had never taken place. Records that could unravel 3 years of covert operations and expose a network that reached into the highest levels of the Pentagon. Her breathing remained steady, but Ghost's mind was now racing through contingencies with the speed of a supercomputer, calculating orbital mechanics. The Pacific Ocean stretched endlessly below, dark and unforgiving. At 4:15 a.m., the game changed. Ghost felt the subtle shift in cabin pressure that preceded an unscheduled course correction, followed by the captain's voice crackling over the intercom with the kind of forced calm that fooled absolutely no one who'd spent time in combat zones. Ladies and gentlemen, we've been advised of some weather ahead and will be making a slight detour to ensure your comfort and safety. We expect to arrive in Tokyo approximately 45 minutes behind schedule. Ghost's eyes opened a fraction, just enough to see the reflection in her phone screen. The SEAL in the business suit was touching his earpiece, receiving instructions through a communication system so subtle it was nearly invisible. His partner 3 rows ahead had shifted position slightly, angling herself for better tactical coverage of the aisle. This wasn't about weather. Military transports didn't get diverted for storms. They flew through conditions that would terrify civilian pilots. Someone had made a decision that required immediate action, and Ghost was the focal point of that decision. The data chip suddenly felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in her carry-on bag. Those flight records weren't just evidence of unsanctioned operations. They were proof that someone in the chain of command had been running black missions, using military assets for purposes that had nothing to do with national security and everything to do with personal profit. She thought about Colonel Marcus Webb, her commanding officer for the past 18 months, a man who'd seemed honorable enough when he'd first approached her about special assignments requiring discretion and exceptional skill. How he'd gradually introduced missions that existed in the gray areas of military law, always with explanations that sounded reasonable until you started connecting the dots. The Syrian incident 3 months ago had been the breaking point. What Webb had described as a humanitarian supply run had actually been an arms delivery to rebels whose allegiances shifted with the highest bidder. Ghost had discovered the truth only when ground fire had damaged her cargo bay, spilling weapons instead of medical supplies across the desert floor. She'd completed the mission. Professional pride and crew safety demanded it, but she'd also begun documenting everything. Every flight plan alteration, every communication from Webb, every suspicious cargo manifest. The data chip contained enough evidence to court-martial a dozen officers and expose a corruption network that had been bleeding military resources for years. The question now was whether these SEALs were here to arrest her for possessing classified information, or to silence her before she could reveal what she knew. Either way, landing in Tokyo was beginning to look increasingly unlikely. The aircraft's engines subtly changed pitch, and Ghost recognized the sound immediately. They were beginning a gradual descent. Not the gentle slope toward a scheduled landing, but the controlled descent of an aircraft being directed to an unplanned destination. Her body remained relaxed, but every instinct screamed danger. Through her partially closed eyes, she watched the SEAL team's leader, a compact woman with prematurely gray hair who'd spent the flight pretending to sleep in seat 12. The woman was now awake, her hand resting casually on what appeared to be a smartphone, but was almost certainly an encrypted communication device. Her lips barely moved as she sub-vocalized into a throat microphone, coordinating with handlers who were tracking their every movement from some anonymous operations center. Ghost's own throat mic had been removed years ago after the incident in Kosovo, when she'd refused a direct order that would have resulted in civilian casualties. Command had deemed her insufficiently compliant for enhanced communication protocols, which was military speak for doesn't follow illegal orders without question. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same independence that had made her invaluable for off-the-books missions had also made her a liability when those missions crossed lines that even black operations weren't supposed to cross. She thought about Captain Alina Martinez, her wingman during the Syrian operation. Alina had questioned the mission parameters from the beginning, voicing doubts that Ghost had been too focused on mission completion to fully consider. 2 weeks after they'd returned, Alina had died in what the official report called a training accident, a helicopter crash during routine maneuvers that experienced pilots simply didn't have. Ghost had attended the funeral, watching Alina's 8-year-old daughter accept a folded flag while trying not to wonder if her mother had died, because she'd asked too many questions about weapons shipments and questionable orders. The data chip wasn't just evidence of corruption. It was Alina's legacy, proof that her suspicions had been correct and her death hadn't been an accident. The SEAL team leader was looking directly at her now, no longer maintaining the pretense of casual observation. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and Ghost saw something unexpected in the other woman's gaze. Not hostility or predatory focus, but something that looked almost like professional respect. Recognition, perhaps. One warrior acknowledging another, even across the divide of conflicting orders and uncertain loyalties. The descent continued, carrying them all toward whatever reckoning awaited below the clouds. The voice that crackled through the cabin speakers at 5:22 a.m. didn't belong to the captain. It was younger, more controlled, carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Chen of United States Air Force Special Operations. I need everyone to remain calm and follow instructions exactly as given. We are conducting a security operation that requires your complete cooperation. Ghost's blood ran cold. She knew that name, knew that voice. Chen had been 2 years ahead of her at the Air Force Academy, a brilliant tactician who'd risen through the ranks with the kind of ruthless efficiency that impressed superiors and terrified subordinates. If Chen was personally overseeing this operation, it meant someone very high up the food chain wanted Ghost neutralized. Around the cabin, passengers began to murmur anxiously. A few reached for their phones before realizing they had no signal at their current altitude and location. The flight attendants moved through the aisles with practiced calm, but Ghost caught the micro-expressions of fear they couldn't quite suppress. "Miss Kozlov," Chen's voice continued, and the cabin fell absolutely silent. "I know you're awake. Please stand slowly and move to the front of the aircraft. No sudden movements, no attempts at evasion. My team has clear lines of sight, and while I'd prefer to resolve this peacefully, they have authorization to use whatever force is necessary." Ghost felt every eye in the cabin turn toward her. The businessman beside her shifted uncomfortably, suddenly realizing he'd been sitting next to whatever person required 5 Navy SEALs and an Air Force lieutenant colonel to apprehend. She opened her eyes fully and sat up with deliberate calm, her hands visible and empty. "Hello, Sarah," she said quietly, her voice carrying to the front of the cabin in the absolute silence. "It's been a while." The SEAL team was in motion now, no longer bothering with concealment. They moved with fluid precision, creating a corridor that guided Ghost forward while maintaining tactical positioning that eliminated any possibility of resistance or escape. Professional, efficient, exactly what she would have expected from Chen's operation. 8 years, Chen replied through the speakers. "You look tired, Val." Funny how carrying evidence of war crimes will do that to person. The silence stretched taut as a wire. Ghost stood slowly, noting how the SEAL's hands shifted closer to concealed weapons. But she also noticed something else. The way the team leader's eyes showed the barest flicker of uncertainty when Ghost mentioned war crimes. These operators were following orders, but they might not know exactly what those orders were protecting. That uncertainty might be the only advantage she had left. Ghost moved toward the front of the cabin with measured steps, her mind cataloging every detail. The aircraft's configuration, the positioning of the SEAL team, the exits, the altitude, the probable destination. All the variables that might matter in the next few minutes when Chen's true intentions became clear. Behind her, passengers whispered prayers in 3 different languages, instinctively understanding they were witnessing something that would haunt their dreams for years to come. The cockpit door opened as Ghost approached, revealing Lieutenant Colonel Chen in person for the first time in 8 years. She looked exactly as Ghost remembered, compact, intense, with eyes that missed nothing and revealed less. But there was something new in her expression, something that might have been regret or might have been resolve. "Hello, Val," Chen said quietly. "We need to talk." "About Elena Martinez." Chen's composure flickered for just an instant, among other things. Ghost stopped 3 feet from the cockpit door, close enough to see the weight Chen carried in her shoulders, the kind of burden that came from making decisions that kept you awake at night. "Are you here to arrest me or kill me, Sarah?" "That depends entirely on what you tell me about Colonel Webb's operation." The SEAL team maintained their positions, but Ghost caught the subtle shift in their posture. They were listening now, processing information that put their mission parameters in a different context. Elite operators weren't mindless automatons. They were intelligent professionals capable of adapting when situations evolved beyond their initial briefing. "Webb's been running guns to Syrian rebels for 18 months, Ghost said clearly, her voice carrying to every corner of the cabin. "Using military assets, forging cargo manifests, and eliminating anyone who asks inconvenient questions. Elena Martinez died because she figured out what was happening." Chen's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Can you prove that?" Ghost smiled without humor. "Every flight log, every communication, every cargo manifest alteration, all of it's on a data chip that gets uploaded to WikiLeaks if I don't check in every 12 hours. It was a lie, but a convincing one. The data chip was real, but Ghost had no dead man's switch, no automated failsafe. She was gambling everything on Chen's uncertainty and the SEAL's growing awareness that this operation might not be what they'd been told. The aircraft shuddered slightly as they encountered turbulence, or perhaps as the pilot adjusted course based on new instructions. Through the small cockpit windows, Ghost could see the first hints of dawn painting the horizon in shades of gold and crimson. Somewhere below those clouds, decisions were being made that would determine whether she lived to see another sunrise. Chen stepped fully into the cabin, closing the cockpit door behind her with a soft click that sounded like a verdict being rendered. The SEAL team remained motionless, but Ghost could sense their heightened attention. These were warriors who'd survived impossible situations by reading subtle cues, And right now those cues were suggesting their mission parameters might be based on incomplete or deliberately misleading information. Webb told me you'd gone rogue, Chen said carefully. That you'd stolen classified materials and were planning to sell them to foreign intelligence services. Webb's lying. Ghost kept her voice steady, professional. He's been using pilots like me to run black operations that have nothing to do with national security. When Alina started asking questions, she had an accident. When I started documenting everything, suddenly I'm a traitor. The SEAL team leader, a woman Ghost now recognized as Commander Rebecca Torres, whose reputation for tactical brilliance was matched only by her absolute integrity, took a half-step forward. "Ma'am," she said to Chen, "if there's any possibility the suspect is telling the truth about war crimes, shouldn't this be handled through proper channels?" Chen's expression tightened. "Your orders come from the highest levels, Commander. Colonel Webb has confirmed that Lieutenant Commander Kozlov poses an immediate threat to national security." "With respect, ma'am," Torres replied, "our orders were to apprehend a rogue pilot carrying stolen classified materials. If we're talking about war crimes and the elimination of military personnel, that changes the tactical and legal parameters considerably." Ghost felt a spark of hope. Torres was thinking like a true professional, someone who understood that following orders didn't mean abandoning critical thinking or moral judgment. The other SEALs were listening intently, their body language suggesting growing uncertainty about the mission they'd been assigned. "The data chip contains flight records proving Webb's operation," Ghost said, directing her words to Torres and the team. "Medical supply runs that were actually weapons deliveries. Humanitarian missions that were arms deals with whoever could pay the highest price. Alina Martinez died because she was going to expose it." Chen's hand moved toward her sidearm, a subtle motion, but one that didn't escape Tor's notice. The commander's own posture shifted almost imperceptibly, ready to react if the situation deteriorated into violence. "Ma'am," Tor said to Chen, her voice carrying the respectful but unmistakable tone of a subordinate who was prepared to disobey orders if necessary. "I need to verify these claims through proper channels before we proceed." The aircraft continued its descent through morning clouds, carrying them toward whatever resolution awaited below. But the dynamics had shifted fundamentally. What had begun as a capture operation was evolving into something far more complex, a moment where professional integrity was being weighed against blind obedience to authority. Ghost remained perfectly still, understanding that her life now depended on Tor's judgment and Chen's next decision. The tension in the cabin had reached a breaking point when Chen's encrypted phone buzzed with an incoming message. She glanced at the screen, and Ghost watched her face go through a series of micro-expressions: surprise, anger, and something that might have been fear. "Change of plans," Chen announced, but her voice lacked its earlier authority. Whatever message she'd received had fundamentally altered the tactical situation. Tor stepped closer, her hand now resting openly on her sidearm. "What kind of change, ma'am?" Chen hesitated, and in that moment of uncertainty, Ghost understood that the lieutenant colonel was no longer in command of the situation. Someone else was pulling the strings, someone with enough authority to override Chen's operational parameters in real time. "Webb's been arrested," Chen said quietly. 15 minutes ago, FBI agents raided his office and residence. They found financial records linking him to arms dealers in 3 different countries. The cabin fell silent except for the steady hum of the aircraft's engines. Ghost felt a mixture of vindication and terror. Vindication that her evidence was being taken seriously. Terror at what Webb's arrest might mean for everyone who'd been involved in his operations, willing or unwilling. "Ma'am," Tor said carefully, "if Colonel Webb has been arrested for the crimes Lieutenant Commander Kozlov described, then our mission parameters were based on false information." Chen nodded slowly, the weight of realization settling on her shoulders like lead. It appears so. Ghost seized the moment. Sarah, how many missions did you run for Webb? How many times did he send you to locations that didn't match the official briefing? Chen's composure cracked slightly. 3 operations in the past 6 months, all classified, all with non-standard parameters. And did any of those operations involve cargo that wasn't what the manifest claimed? The silence stretched for almost 30 seconds before Chen answered, yes. Torres was now studying Chen with the same intensity she'd been watching Ghost. The entire tactical situation had flipped. The suspected criminal was revealing evidence of actual crimes, while the arresting officer was potentially an unwitting accomplice. Commander Torres, Ghost said, turning to address the SEAL team leader directly. I have enough evidence on that data chip to implicate dozens of officers in Webb's operation. People who thought they were following legitimate orders but were actually participating in war crimes. If you help me get this information to the proper authorities, we can distinguish between the criminals and the victims. Torres looked at Chen, then back at Ghost. And if we don't? Then Webb's network will sacrifice everyone below him on the chain of command to protect the people at the top. Officers like Colonel Chen will face court-martial, while the real architects of this operation disappear into comfortable retirements. The truth of that statement hung in the air like smoke from a battlefield. Everyone present understood the military's tendency to protect institutional reputation by sacrificing individual careers. Chen straightened slowly, and Ghost saw the moment when the lieutenant colonel made her decision, not as someone following orders, but as an officer choosing between self-preservation and doing what was right. Commander Torres, Chen said formally, I'm requesting that you secure Lieutenant Commander Kozlov as a protected witness rather than a suspect. Torres nodded, understood, ma'am. The aircraft continued its descent, but now they were flying toward justice rather than covering up crimes. The landing at Yokota Air Base came with the kind of choreographed precision that spoke of high-level coordination and urgent priorities. As the aircraft touched down, Ghost could see through the small windows that the runway was lined with military vehicles, FBI agents, and what appeared to be officials from both the Air Force Office of Special Investigations and the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. This wasn't a simple arrest anymore. It had evolved into a full-scale investigation with implications that reached far beyond Webb's corrupt operation. Commander Torres had spent the final 30 minutes of the flight coordinating with ground personnel through encrypted communications, establishing protocols that would protect Ghost as a key witness, while ensuring the data chip's contents were properly secured and authenticated. Ma'am, Torres said to Ghost as the aircraft came to a complete stop, you'll be escorted directly to a secure facility where you'll provide a full deposition. Federal prosecutors are already reviewing the preliminary evidence, and they'll want detailed testimony about every mission you flew for Colonel Webb. Ghost nodded, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling into her bones. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was fading, leaving behind the accumulated fatigue of months of carrying dangerous secrets while pretending everything was normal. What happens to the people who were following orders? She asked Torres. Pilots like me and Colonel Chen who thought we were serving our country. That depends on the evidence and their level of knowledge, Torres replied honestly. But generally, the military justice system distinguishes between willing participants and manipulated assets. If you were genuinely unaware of the criminal nature of your missions, that weighs heavily in your favor. Chen had been silent during the landing procedures, but now she spoke up. Commander, I need to know, when did you first suspect the mission parameters were incorrect? Torres considered the question carefully. When Lieutenant Commander Kozlov mentioned war crimes and the elimination of military personnel. Our briefing described her as a rogue agent selling secrets, but her demeanor and statements suggested someone trying to expose corruption rather than profit from it. Elite operators learn to trust their instincts about people. The aircraft door opened, and Ghost saw Agent Patricia Hendricks of the FBI waiting at the bottom of the stairs. Hendricks had a reputation for handling sensitive military cases with both thoroughness and discretion, which meant someone in the Justice Department was taking this investigation very seriously indeed. As Ghost descended the stairs flanked by Tor's team, now functioning as protective escort rather than captors, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just for herself, but for Elena Martinez's memory and for all the other military personnel who'd been unknowingly used by Webb's criminal network. The morning sun was fully visible now, casting long shadows across the runway and painting everything in shades of gold and possibility. The debriefing room at Yakota's intelligence center was sterile and windowless, but Ghost had spent enough time in similar facilities to find the familiar environment oddly comforting. Agent Hendricks sat across from her at a metal table, flanked by Colonel James Mitchell from the Air Force Office of Special Investigations and Commander Sarah Park from NCIS. The data chip lay between them like a small silver oracle, its contents already uploaded and being analyzed by teams of investigators who would spend the next several weeks unraveling the full scope of Webb's operation. "Let's start with Captain Martinez," Hendricks said, activating a digital recorder. "You believe her death wasn't accidental?" Ghost leaned forward slightly. Elena questioned every aspect of the Syrian mission from the beginning. She noticed discrepancies between our briefing materials and what we encountered on the ground. 2 weeks after we returned, she scheduled a meeting with the Inspector General's office. "How do you know about that meeting?" Colonel Mitchell asked. "She told me." Elena was careful, methodical. She wanted to document everything before making any formal accusations. Ghost paused, remembering her friend's determination to do the right thing regardless of personal cost. She died in a helicopter crash 3 days before the scheduled meeting. Commander Park consulted her notes. The official investigation concluded that Captain Martinez's crash was caused by mechanical failure, a catastrophic rotor malfunction that couldn't have been predicted or prevented. "Convenient timing," Ghost replied. "And if you examine the maintenance records for that aircraft, I believe you'll find that it received unscheduled service from a contractor with ties to Webb's operation." Hendricks exchanged glances with her colleagues. "We're already looking into that. What we need from you now is a detailed timeline of every mission you flew for Colonel Webb, starting with your first assignment 18 months ago." For the next 4 hours, Ghost methodically reconstructed her involvement in Webb's operation. She described cargo manifests that didn't match actual payloads, flight plans that were altered without explanation, and landing strips in locations that supposedly didn't exist according to official maps. The investigators took detailed notes, occasionally asking for clarification or additional context. But Ghost could see in their expressions that her testimony was confirming intelligence they'd already gathered from other sources: financial records, communications intercepts, and possibly other witnesses who'd come forward once Webb's arrest became known. "You mentioned earlier that you documented everything," Colonel Mitchell said during a brief break. "When did you start keeping those records?" "After the Syria mission," Ghost replied. "Elena's questions made me start paying attention to details I'd previously ignored. I realized that what we'd been told was humanitarian aid was actually weapons bound for rebel groups whose allegiances changed based on whoever was paying them that week. And you continued flying missions for Webb, even after you suspected illegal activity." Ghost met Mitchell's gaze steadily. "I needed evidence, not just suspicions, and I needed to protect other personnel who were unknowingly involved. If I'd refused missions or raised premature alarms, Webb would have simply replaced me with another pilot, and eliminated any chance of exposing the entire operation. The truth was more complex than that, but Ghost knew that investigators understood the difficult position junior officers faced when confronting potential corruption among senior command staff. Agent Hendricks leaned forward. "We need to discuss what happens next." The words that would determine the rest of Ghost's life were about to be spoken in this windowless room, thousands of miles from home. Agent Hendricks opened a manila folder that had been sitting untouched throughout the morning's questioning. "The evidence you've provided has been corroborated by financial records seized from Colonel Webb's residence and office. Wire transfers totaling over $3 million from arms dealers in Syria, Afghanistan, and Libya." Ghost felt a mix of vindication and nausea. $3 million in blood money, paid for weapons that had probably killed American soldiers and innocent civilians alike. "Additionally," Hendricks continued, "we've identified 17 other military personnel who were involved in Webb's operation to varying degrees. Most appear to have been unwitting participants, but a few clearly knew they were violating federal law." Colonel Mitchell leaned forward. "Lieutenant Commander, based on your cooperation and the evidence suggesting you were attempting to expose criminal activity rather than participate in it, the Air Force is prepared to offer you full immunity in exchange for your continued testimony." "What about the others?" Ghost asked immediately. "The pilots and ground crew who were just following orders?" Commander Park answered, "Each case will be evaluated individually, but the presumption is that personnel who were genuinely unaware of the criminal nature of their assignments will face administrative rather than criminal penalties." "And Elena Martinez?" "Captain Martinez's death is now being investigated as a homicide," Hendricks said quietly. "We've found evidence suggesting her helicopter was sabotaged. The mechanic who performed the unscheduled maintenance has agreed to cooperate in exchange for witness protection." Ghost closed her eyes, feeling grief and relief in equal measure. Elena's instincts had been correct, and now there might finally be justice for her murder. "There's one more thing," Hendricks said. "We need you to continue flying missions for the next 2 weeks." Ghost's eyes snapped open. "What?" "Webb's network extends beyond just arms dealing. We believe he was also involved in human trafficking and drug smuggling. Some of his co-conspirators don't yet know he's been arrested, and we need to identify them before they disappear." Colonel Mitchell nodded. "You'd be flying under FBI surveillance with full backup and support. The missions would be designed to draw out the remaining members of Webb's network." Ghost stared at them in disbelief. "You want me to keep flying illegal missions as bait?" "We want you to help us save lives," Hendricks replied. "Every day this network operates, people die. Soldiers in combat zones who face weapons that were supposed to be destroyed. Civilians caught in conflicts fueled by illegal arms sales. Victims of human trafficking who might never be found if we don't identify all the players." The room fell silent as Ghost considered the request. 2 more weeks of deception, of pretending to be Webb's compliant pilot while secretly working to destroy everything he'd built. But also 2 weeks of finally serving her country, the way she'd always intended when she first put on the uniform. "I'll do it," she said. The next morning, Ghost found herself back in a cockpit for the first time in 3 weeks, preparing for a mission that would officially never happen. The C-130J Super Hercules hummed with familiar energy beneath her hands as she completed pre-flight checks, but everything else about the situation was surreal. In the cargo bay behind her, FBI agents posed as ground crew members while sophisticated surveillance equipment masqueraded as routine maintenance tools. Every word she spoke would be recorded, every location logged with GPS precision, every contact documented for later prosecution. Her co-pilot for this mission was Lieutenant Marcus Chen, no relation to Sarah, a young officer who'd been briefed on the operation's true nature and chosen for his ability to maintain composure under pressure. He was checking whether reports with the kind of exaggerated attention to detail that suggested he was as nervous as she was. "Tower, this is Falcon 77 requesting clearance for departure," Ghost transmitted, using the call sign Webb had assigned for this particular route. "Falcon 77, you're cleared for takeoff. Maintain heading 270 and climb to 15,000 feet." The familiar routine of takeoff procedures helped calm Ghost's nerves. Whatever deception was required once they reached their destination. For now, she was simply doing what she'd been trained to do: fly aircraft with precision and skill. Their destination was a small airfield in northern Mexico, officially closed to civilian traffic, but apparently still operational for certain off-the-books activities. According to Webb's final instructions, they would deliver what appeared to be agricultural equipment, but was actually sophisticated communications gear bound for a drug cartel with ties to arms dealers in Central America. "How many people do you think know what we're really carrying?" Lieutenant Chen asked once they'd reached cruising altitude. "Fewer than you'd expect," Ghost replied. Webb's operation depended on compartmentalization. Most personnel only knew their small piece of the overall mission. Through her headphones, she could hear the subtle electronic signatures of the FBI's surveillance equipment, actively monitoring their communications and tracking their position. Somewhere in an underground facility, agents were coordinating with international law enforcement agencies to ensure that everyone who touched this cargo shipment would be identified and eventually arrested. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was finally flying missions that would genuinely serve justice and protect innocent lives, even though those missions technically violated numerous federal laws. 2 hours into the flight, Ghost's radio crackled with an unexpected transmission on a frequency that wasn't supposed to exist according to official documentation. "Falcon 77, this is Desert Fox. We need to discuss a change in delivery protocols." Ghost's blood ran cold. Desert Fox had been Webb's personal call sign, and hearing it now meant that someone else had taken over his operation, someone who didn't know he'd been arrested. The trap was about to spring shut on whoever was waiting in Mexico. Ghost keyed her microphone carefully, aware that every word would be analyzed by both the FBI agents monitoring from the United States and whoever was calling from the Desert Fox position. "Desert Fox, this is Falcon 77. Repeat your message." "We've had some security concerns regarding the delivery location. New GPS coordinates will be transmitted on auxiliary frequency Charlie 7. Acknowledge when received." Lieutenant Chen looked at her with barely concealed alarm. This wasn't in their briefing. The FBI had prepared for contact with ground personnel at the original airfield, not a diversion to an unknown location that could be anywhere within a 1,000-mile radius. Ghost switched to the auxiliary frequency and copied down the new coordinates, her mind racing through possibilities. The location was approximately 200 miles southwest of their original destination, in a region she knew was controlled by the Zambrano cartel, one of Mexico's most violent criminal organizations. "Falcon 77, confirm you have new coordinates," came the voice again, and this time Ghost detected something in the speaker's tone that made her skin crawl. Anticipation mixed with something that might have been predatory satisfaction. "Confirmed, Desert Fox. New coordinates received." "Excellent. We have some associates who are very eager to meet with Colonel Webb's personal pilot. They have questions about future operations." The threat was barely veiled. Whoever had taken over Webb's network knew that Ghost had been his primary pilot for sensitive missions, and they wanted to either